So, hello, thanks for coming out to learn about corporate entities. I am Mariam Morshedi from RREAF's legal department, here to tell you about how we structure our deals. So you might have a good idea of what we do here at RREAF. We buy properties, sometimes we buy companies along with properties, we hold them, we manage them, we improve them, we turn them over for a profit. But how do we structure our deals? What are the entities that underlie our deals, and what are the documents that we create to run the companies the way that we want them to be run? That is the point of our presentation today. So I will start you off with a list of the entities in our deals. So this doesn't necessarily mean anything to you. And in fact, when you file an entity with the state, they don't really care what you name it. It's sort of arbitrary, within reason, of course. But we like to keep to a certain naming convention to kind of keep track of our deals and our entities. So the next slide will highlight aspects of our naming convention. You will see there's a manager, there's a master land development LLC, and there is a basic deal name, Plum Creek Caldwell, as a limited partnership. And all of them have the deal name in it. So Plum Creek Caldwell LP, that's going to be the actual property owning entity. So that's the entity that will borrow the loan if we're going to be entering into a loan. That's the entity that's actually buying the property. So the next slide will give you an idea of how the entities relate to each other, and that will be our org charts. So find the names that I was just going over. You have, at the bottom, you have Plum Creek Caldwell LP, which is the limited partnership, owns title to the actual property. The 100% owner is the Plum Creek Caldwell Master Land Development Company. So when we get investors and we do an offering, I think you guys learned about the offerings that we do to raise money for these deals. The investors' money goes into Plum Creek Caldwell Master Land Development Company. We call it the holding company. So now we have a PropCo and we have a holding company. And then in green on the right is the manager. So the manager is actually authorized to make decisions on behalf of the entities, both the property company and the holding company, which also means that the investors don't necessarily always manage the entity. Especially when we have common class investors, you'll see at the far top left, we have our Class A members. Those are common class investors. So if you're putting up a certain portion, which could be as little as $50,000, but generally upwards, you're not going to be able to control a huge portion of what's happening in the entities. That's because the manager is the one with primary control. And who do you think controls the manager? You will see on top of the manager entity, that is the sponsor. So that is RREAF Holdings. So even though RREAF Holdings may not necessarily be putting a lot of money into the holding company, investing a lot of money into the project, they do control the entity. They put a lot of work into it. And they get to decide what contracts the entity engages in. So in the next part of the presentation, I am going to explain how the law developed to support such a distribution of responsibility. Why is it so structured all over the place? How is it that you can distribute that? And it's sort of conventions in the law over time that have enabled companies to be able to distribute responsibility this way. So I have identified what I find to be the 4 factors justifying a deal structure and justifying the way we design our entities. There are others. There are more than 4, and in fact, I'll be adding another one later. But these 4 I found are the most useful for our presentation, and you will see those here. So let's take it with a base example. So when you're buying a home, which is the most basic form of a real estate purchase transaction, this is going to be the simple base case. So these are the 4 factors. Who is contributing to the purchase? Who's benefiting from the purchase? Who's making decisions about the purchase and controlling the home after it's purchased, for example? And then who takes on the liability for any issues that arise with respect to the purchase? Does anyone want to guess, and this is not a trick question, who that would be in the case of buying a home? It all tends to be the same person. Usually it's an individual or a married couple. So that's why it's a simple case. That's why you don't actually have an org chart when you buy a home. You could if you wanted to, but in the simple case, the law provides sort of a base set of scenarios for people buying a home because it's such a common situation and because you don't need to distribute responsibility in the way that we do in our deals. So yeah, just to go through those factors again, you have one individual contributing to the home, you have one individual benefiting from the home, or a couple. You have the same individuals deciding when to sell the home, when to mow the lawn, when to fix the toilet, and then taking on liability with respect to the home. And they might also contract out for insurance, which most of the lenders require you to do. Anyone want to guess why there's an asterisk by married couple? I will tell you why I put an asterisk by married couple. It's a sort of unique partnership under the law. We tend to consider married couples like individuals. We can file our taxes together. The law provides certain structures to kind of binding married couples together in a way that we don't need partnerships agreements, but those sort of the agreements between married couples are implicit in laws and the relationships between married couples. It's actually only when you get divorced that you realize how much of a partnership a married couple is. All right, any questions, comments so far? Okay, so now we'll take a look at Plum Creek Caldwell and what is going on with a commercial property that is a lot more complex. Let's look at the same factors. So this is an aerial sketch of the development plans for the over 3,000 acre property that is Plum Creek Caldwell LP's property. There's a lot more going on here. There's a lot more money involved and a lot more decisions to be made. Also, the type of benefit is different. You're not here to live in a home, you're here to make money off of this project. So let's consider the same factors. Look at the contributions. Who's contributing? So the purchase price of the property was about $100 million. Let's say, for simplicity's sake, and this is about the ballpark, the loan that we got was $50 million. Who put up the other $50 million? That's a big chunk of change. So if you have a single investor, they might want to share the risk with others. That's the reason why people start to form partnerships, especially if they're going to be making money off of it. Why does one person want to put up all the money and take on all the risk if other people could stand to make money and they can share the risk for losing that money? Decision making. So you may know by now that RREAF tends to manage these deals. So you have RREAF that's actually putting a lot of work into the project. They're the ones who created this picture, for example. And not necessarily putting up the money for it. So you're actually spreading out, as I showed, the distribution of responsibility. And liability. Liability is actually a pretty tricky question, and in the next few slides we'll learn a little bit more about how the concept of limited liability came about with respect to early partnerships. But generally there's economic liability, which is the money that people put into the project. And then there's general liability for what if something goes wrong and there's excess, aside from just the economic money that somebody put into the project, what if there's a claim that's in addition to that amount? Okay, and here is the org chart again. Sort of reminding you what we just went over. Any questions? All right. So now we're going to go on a history lesson to learn about early partnerships. So this is sort of the common example of how partnerships started. You would have a merchant traveling via ship across the ocean to sell goods. It turned out that not everyone who wants to make that journey has the money to fund it, and not everyone who has the money to fund it will actually want to take that journey. So you would have, as in this example, one guy who would put up more money and pay for the ship, the goods, and the crew, and another guy to make the journey. Like in this example, the passive investor is putting up 2/3 of the money and not traveling. The traveling merchant is putting up a third of the money and taking on the risk of the journey and doing all the work. And they share equally in the profits, which is giving economic value to the work of the traveling merchant. So the biggest issue with early partnerships was that you had unlimited personal liability. If something went wrong with the project in excess of the money that you put up for it, the people whose property you damaged or any other issues, they could come back to the partners or the individuals and actually take your personal assets. So that's why I have dominoes up there, because once the business falls, you could fall too. So in the coming years, throughout the 20th century, the law would evolve. It would find ways to incentivize individuals to take business risk, because if people had to risk their homes to engage in business investments, they might rather not. So that reluctance to engage in business because of the risk is what brought about the concept of limited liability. So limited partnerships, they emerged in the early 1900s with the Uniform Limited Partnership Act in 1916. That provided limited liability for passive investors. I'm sure if I give David Craigle a mic right now, he would tell you a lot more of what was in that act. But for purposes of my presentation, that's as far as I'm going to go into it. It also provided some rules on formalizing a partnership agreement between the partners, because you would have to stipulate the terms. Once you're getting more formal, you have to start documenting things. So that's why you see this guy is having a nice barbecue while his business burns to the ground in the background. He's untouched, in theory. He does look a little stressed out, though. All right, so as with any model, the first one is not necessarily the best. So there were updates to the ULPA. By the end of the 1970s, we had amendments that gave increased flexibility and more limited liability to partnerships. So as an example, early limited partnerships said that the general partner, which is the person doing the work, would still have liability for the project, but only the passive investors would have limited liability. So that concept started to change when you realized that you would have investors that wanted to make managerial decisions. They wanted to at least have some involvement in the actions of the entity. So the amendments to the ULPA carved out certain managerial responsibilities that the passive investors could do and engage in, make business decisions without losing their limited liability. I also do believe at that time is when you started to get into the more modern requirements of documentation that are something that I'm going to show in the second half of this presentation. All right, so then we get into filing requirements. So you will have to, once you file for an entity, you want to tell the state it exists. You want to tell the federal government it exists so that they can keep track of you for tax purposes. You want to define what your company does, who owns it, who controls it, and you want to determine how the company operates. So think about those 4 factors that we identified earlier, and I'm going to add a big one on, which is tax, because at some point there came about certain tax benefits that you can receive through companies, or you have different options that may suit better individual investors' tax situations. That's another one of the huge factors. So you want to put that all somewhere in some documentation. Some of it is required to be filed with the state or the federal government. Some of it is internal stuff, but you need to have it on hand, because once you start dealing with lenders and dealing with other people, especially if you want people to invest in your company, you're going to need to tell them how it operates, who's benefiting, how they're filing their taxes, and many other items, in fact. Okay, so here's an example of our base documents. This is, again, just a copy from our legal file. So let's start at the bottom. You have Plum Creek Caldwell's Certificate of Formation. That tells the state that your entity exists. It's not very legal. It's not very detailed. It just says, I think I have placed in another slide to tell you the basics, but it just says the purpose. This is how you get in touch with me, and now my entity exists. The W-9 and the EIN, those are both tax related, so that makes sure that Uncle Sam can track you. And the top one is the Limited Partnership Agreement. That is arguably the most important document, and I'll get into it a little bit in a couple more slides down. So when David wanted me to make this presentation, I know he wanted me to explain the big differences between limited partnerships, corporations, and limited liability companies. I can tell you that I could have done a whole lot more research on this, but I'm going to give you the short version also. So limited partnerships is what we decided to use for the Plum Creek Caldwell's base property company. The other one that we tend to use a lot in our deals is limited liability companies, because limited liability companies have more flexibility in some ways. Corporations are taxed twice. So they're taxed once when the corporation gets income and once when the shareholders receive their distributions. So that's an option that a lot of larger companies want to use. But then again, the main difference between limited partnerships and limited liability companies is that for our holding company, for example, we have several classes of membership. We have the common class investors. We might raise money from a significant investor. That would be a priority investor. And then you could even have, and then you have your promote class, which is RREAF, who's sponsoring the deal and putting up sort of a nominal amount. So you actually want to have different rights. And limited partnerships, if I'm not wrong, David, you can only have one class. Is it wrong?
You have as many.
You can? Oh, okay. All right, thank you. So I correct for the mic that limited partnerships can have different classes of membership interest. Okay, so I promised an anatomy presentation. That's at least the title of this presentation. So the second half is going to sort of show that just like a human needs functioning parts to work, so does a corporation. So I'm going to talk about how those documents can kind of form a functioning being. So this is your initial concept. It's like a box that you have on the workshop. This is your idea that you want to start a business. It's a 2D box. It doesn't really do anything. You might have an idea how it's supposed to function, but you haven't really told anybody about it. You might have told your business partner, but no one else really knows how it's supposed to function. You can consider this to be a general partnership, which is like the historical partnerships. You and I could actually work together and just start putting our money together, but you're not going to get any benefits of what the law has provided, like limited liability and these other tax benefits, because you're just having a general partnership. So then you file those initial documents, your certificate of formation and your EIN with the federal government. And that, again, like I said, the certificate of formation tells the state, I exist, this is my name, this is how you get in touch with me, and here's a very general purpose. The EIN allows Uncle Sam to keep track of you. But at least now the government recognizes you. You can start to put money in your box. And now it's a 3D box. It's starting to get there. All right, again, you haven't defined all of these factors. Again, you'll see I added taxes on there because that's a really important factor. But this guy goes to try to make his box function. It doesn't really do anything. That is what you are going to need the operating agreement for. And if it's a limited partnership, it's called a limited partnership agreement. At some point, and Molly, will you remind me to create a slide that shows the different terminology between if you're dealing with a limited partnership versus an LLC? Because sometimes these things function the same way, but who would know that an operating agreement is the same as a limited partnership agreement, except that you just need to know that they generally function the same way. It's a lot. I learned this. David took me on, and I didn't have experience in this type of law. So for me, it was all like scrambling around and trying to figure this stuff out. So everyone has to do it at some point. So this is going to be the lengthier document. This is how you're going to get, this box is going to get its legs and its arms to start functioning, which is by their operating agreement or the limited partnership agreement. You're going to define the purpose, the contributions, liabilities, your tax choices, how you do the accounting, who's responsible for it, and who's going to be managing the entity and making decisions for it. So here, this is actually just screenshots. Now I actually moved on to the holding company LLC operating agreement instead of the limited partnership. So this is just screenshots that I took from Plum Creek Caldwell's holding company operating agreement. I have a question. When I just said Plum Creek Caldwell's holding company operating agreement, do you guys follow now where it is on the chart? That's the idea. It could just sound like all words, but if you're following and you start to pick up our naming convention and how it all works, then you can kind of track, instead of just being a blurb of words like a different language, you can follow like, oh yeah, that's going to be the blue box that was in the middle, and it's the operating agreement, which is the one that makes the entity function. So again, this is not very specific either. You actually kind of want to leave it general because you want to allow your company a little bit of flexibility to function. So this says, the purpose of this company is to get funding for its subsidiary to engage in a project that's sort of real estate, related. It talks about the property. And, then you're going to do all things necessary or incidental to pay, to any of the foregoing purposes. Okay, so this is defining the membership classes. Your common class investor is going to have different benefits from your preferred equity investor who's giving a lot more money. And your promotes will also have different rights and benefits. Again, the promote is the sponsor, which is RREAF, and sometimes RREAF has a partner that is a dual sponsorship with RREAF. Distributions. This is one of the most important provisions, obviously. People don't invest in a deal unless they're going to be getting something from it. So they're putting up money. They want to see how the money is going to come back to them. So this shows how when Plum Creek Caldwell sells portions of the property, how the money is going to be prioritized. So you will see that priority member is prioritized over, and then over the Class A units, but in between, after you pay the priority member, sometimes you might have to repay any loans that you had to accept in case of cost overruns. But then you get to the common class, and then the remainder is Class B units, which is the promote. So Class B is not prioritized in timing, but it gets all of the remainder. So that is the sponsor's incentive to do well in the project. They're getting all the rest. Okay, in management, let's give this guy a brain or a head to function. Who runs the show? Again, you saw that the green box on that chart is the decision maker. So that's the managing entity, and that is generally controlled by RREAF or the sponsorship parties. So in LLC, you could opt to have an LLC managed by its members, but as we just discussed, in our case, we don't want the members to be managing. We want the manager to be taking control of the decisions. And you can also assign officers of the company. So the officers are agents of the company, that they're not the manager, they're not empowered to act in exclusively like the manager is, but the officers have the power to sign documents. The entity needs a way to get things done, so you don't want just one entity to be able to sign. You want officers to be able to actually execute documents on behalf of the company. So in this analogy, the manager and the officers are the head or the brain. Here are a couple screenshots from this operating agreement showing that, the management of the company by the manager is to manage, and then sometimes it'll get more specific, especially in our deals where we have common class investors. We want to show that the manager can't just do anything. The manager, we have some agreements that the property company can engage in fee agreements with a sponsor. So you have to reveal that all in the property company levels agreement, and you want to make sure that the manager is not allowed to just go ahead and give itself a bunch of compensation on behalf of the property company. So the investors want to know that. They want to know what are the limitations on the manager's authority. So here are some more general powers, specific responsibilities. Here is a provision in the operating agreement looking at officers. So I will tell you that if you do skim operating agreements, the first thing to do is skim them. Do not read word for word an operating agreement. You want to look at the headers. You want to see what the articles correspond to, and then start getting down into the subheaders, which are these, because you could waste your time reading one little provision and realize that it's something tax related and you really don't care about it unless you're David Craigle. All right, let's see where I'm at now. All right, the heart. So I consider the investors to be the heart because they're the thing that actually ends up, it's arguable, but I think the investors are the ones that are running the show from the sort of, I don't know how to describe it, but as you can understand, the investors are running the show. If you work with a lender or a preferred equity investor, they definitely want to know who's investing in this because obviously the people who put up more money, if they're putting up substantial contributions into the company, they're going to have a say over what's happening with it. There's a rule called the beneficial ownership rule that is somewhat recent. Do you know what year that was enacted, David? The beneficial ownership rule? Requiring background searches on investors that have more than 25%. It wasn't too long ago, though. It was in the last 10 years, right?
Yeah, I believe that's right. I believe it was in the last 10 years or so.
Yeah, so now we give an org chart that goes all the way up to the individual investors. So above where we have the common class investors and the priority investors, they want to know, well, who actually in those entities is going to be the base individual that's putting up at least 25% or more. And they have to, the lenders will have to run background searches on each of those individuals. And here is the membership schedule showing the investors in Plum Creek Caldwell's holding company. This is an attachment to the LLC operating agreement. Just to close the loop here, we talked about liability. This is showing that in the operating agreement, it does say that the members have limited liability, especially a common class investor. Nobody's going to want to invest in your project if they're not going to have limited liability. So this is actually the end of my presentation, I think, almost, because once you've done all that, you're going to have a functioning entity. And you'll make David Craigle very happy. Yeah, exactly. Okay, so the last thing before questions, I'll take you off the screen for now, David. You're welcome. The last thing before questions, I want to talk about corporate consents. I didn't have time to go too much into it in the slides, but if you talk to a lender or you talk to any people who are doing business with your company, they're going to want to know that your company actually authorized whatever transaction is happening. So they're going to say, well, give me the corporate consent for it. It's a formal document that just says the company has authorized this, but you have to look at your distribution of responsibility in your operating agreement. So who has the authority to sign on behalf of the company? And you have to make sure that all those people or the one relevant person has signed. So a consent is sort of a different set of document. So it's not one of your base foundational documents, but every time you engage in a transaction, you're going to need a consent to do one of those things. So they're formal, they need signatures, and the lenders are very serious about making sure that they're properly executed. And that is all I have for you today. Any questions?